So in order to see that in action too, because it's actually a very different configuration, we're going to create a Kubernetes cluster on Linode, and we're going to deploy to that cluster. And we're going to see how deploying to Kubernetes cluster from Jenkins works without additional platform-specific authentication, like we did in the AWS case. And also note that there are different ways of connecting from Jenkins to Kubernetes, depending on which platform you're using, etc. There are different credential types and so on. So you may encounter lots of different methods. However, I'm trying to use the simplest one, the most straightforward one, and also something that is more flexible for you to use. So in this part, we're gonna create a Kubernetes cluster, a very simple one with just one node on Linode managed Kubernetes service. And we're gonna use the config file from that Linode cluster in order to connect and authenticate with Kubernetes. And we're gonna see how that works. So in this case, there are 4 things that we need to do. The first one is having kubectl command available inside Jenkins container, which we already did. So we have kubectl command already installed. So we have that step already completed. The second one is we're going to need to install a Jenkins plugin that will make it possible for us to execute kubectl with kubeconfig credentials. So basically, instead of creating the kubeconfig of Linode's Kubernetes cluster inside the Jenkins container, we're going to configure it as a credential inside Jenkins. Because it's a different type of config file, we can actually use that as a credential, unlike the AWS config file, which was more reliant on the authenticator in addition. So once we have that credential of the kubeconfig file, we're going to use the plugin inside our Jenkins file. So using the plugin, we can execute the kubectl command that will deploy Nginx deployment and pod inside the Linode cluster. So let's get started. So first, let's create a Linode Kubernetes cluster. And again, this is going to be the same step if you have bare metal cluster setup, because you only need to authenticate with the cluster directly and not the platform in addition. So let's create the cluster. I'm just going to choose the smallest one, just one node, very simple. And the cluster should be up and running very soon. Now, you obviously see that compared to the AWS EKS cluster, this is super fast and you have very small amount of configuration that you need to do. And the cluster is going to be up and running very soon, including the worker nodes, which we just have one. And the reason why this is so easy to create and get started with, and also so fast, is that AWS has much more granular control of the infrastructure. So basically have much more things that you can actually, or you're able to configure when creating the instances or creating the Kubernetes cluster on AWS. For example, the VPC concepts and whole networking with the subnets and private public subnets, etc. You don't have access to this kind of stuff here. But on the other side, if you don't really care about them and you just want to go with the defaults, this is actually super easy way to do that, because you can get started in just a couple of minutes with a couple of clicks and you have an up and running cluster that you can connect to. And you don't even need some special command line tool for that. So cluster is ready, our worker node is running, and we have kubeconfig file that got generated, which we can download. So I'm going to download that one. And kubeconfig file, as you saw earlier as well, is going to help me connect to the cluster using kubectl command. So let's actually check that. Now I'm already connected using my kubectl command to EKS cluster, right? So if I want to point my kubectl to another cluster, to another location, I can export kubeconfig and this is actually the command. So this kubeconfig file is going to set kubectl context to linode using this file we just downloaded. And now if I do kubectl get nodes, you're going to see I'm connected to linode, LKE, and I just have one worker node. So we have the Kubernetes cluster on linode. That was pretty fast and easy. Now let's actually make use of it. As I said, the next step will be to create a credential using that kubeconfig file in Jenkins, because just like we did here, Jenkins needs to access that kubeconfig file as well. And let's go ahead and in our multi-branch pipeline store, let's create another credential. And this time it will be another kind of secret file. And when I choose that, I can actually upload a file from my local computer to Jenkins. And this is the test kubeconfig YAML file that I downloaded, and we can give it a name. Let's call it linode or LKE credentials and create it. So now we have a secret file which is based on the kubeconfig YAML file. As a next step, let's actually install the plugin for using this kubeconfig file to execute kubectl commands. The second step, as I mentioned, is to install plugin in Jenkins that will allow us to connect this kubectl to an actual cluster. So on Jenkins, manage Jenkins, we're gonna go to plugins, and in available, I'm gonna look for Kubernetes CLI. And if I remove this, you see there are a bunch of Kubernetes plugins available for Jenkins actually. So we have the Kubernetes. This is one of the most popular ones, which makes kubectl available, so you wouldn't have to install it directly inside Jenkins container. However, this is a little bit more complex and works actually, or is more suitable for when you have Jenkins cluster. So you have multiple nodes and agents for Jenkins jobs. So we're going to go with an easier one and choose the Kubernetes CLI. And we're going to install it. And some of the dependency plugins also need to be installed first before the installation can complete. So I'm going to go ahead and restart my Jenkins server to complete the installation. And this is going to take a couple of minutes to complete here. Remember, Jenkins is running as a Docker container on your DigitalOcean droplet. So you might need to SSH back into the server and restart your container to be able to log back into Jenkins. Okay, awesome. Jenkins is up and running again. And if I go to manage Jenkins, plugins and installed plugins, you can see Kubernetes CLI is installed and enabled. And by the way, if you want to know more about the plugins in Jenkins that you install, whatever plugin that may be, you can always click on the plugin name and you will see the documentation that describes basically what it does. It also has the links to the repository and so on. So you can always check this information from here. So we have Kubernetes CLI plugin installed. And now we are ready to make changes to Jenkins file in order to deploy to Kubernetes cluster that is running on linode. So now that we have everything prepared, it's time to configure our Jenkins file to execute kubectl command. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another branch, another feature branch for trying that deployment in the LKE cluster. So let's actually go ahead and create that branch. Deploy to LKE. And let's get rid of this right here. And again, in the deploy stage, we're going to configure running kubectl command against LKE cluster. So we have the credential for kubeconfig and we have the kubectl command available. How do we now tell kubectl, how to connect to this LKE cluster, or basically which cluster to connect to with which credentials. And that comes from that kubectl CLI plugin that we installed. And we're going to use that plugin using with kubeconfig. And the syntax for this is pretty similar to with credentials, as you probably already noticed. So inside that with kubeconfig, we're going to access the kubeconfig credential we created. So credentials ID is going to be the first parameter here. And we're going to set it to LKE credentials. That's how we called it. So now we have the kubeconfig for the kubectl to use on its execution. Now, the second part is we need to tell kubectl where to connect to the cluster, right? So the server URL is going to be the cluster endpoint. And if we go back to Linode, right here, Kubernetes API endpoint, we are going to see the endpoint. And since 443 is actually the default of HTTPS, I'm just going to copy that part. And we're going to copy that endpoint right here. So let's actually close this. And we're going to open a block here. So within that with kubeconfig context, we can now execute kubectl. So kubectl will execute, it will take the kubeconfig file that we defined as a credential using this plugin and try to connect to and authenticate with the Kubernetes cluster at this URL. So with this configuration, let's actually try to execute a pipeline for our new branch deployed to LKE. So I'm gonna check this in to LKE and let's push the branch. I'm going to copy the name of the branch and we're going to configure this on Jenkins. So let's save it. And we should see deploy to LKE getting executed. And as you see, it went through. Let's check the output. Right here, you see kubectl create deployment, nginx deployment created. So now if I do kubectl get pod, there you go, our nginx pod is up and running. So obviously it was way easier without the additional platform authentication. And as I said, this is going to be the case on bare metal or on LKE, on some other managed Kubernetes clusters, but it really depends on the platform, right? So we saw the example on AWS as well with additional platform authentication. So this is basically how you can deploy to Kubernetes cluster from Jenkins Pipeline with two different scenarios. In the next part, we're going to see the deployment as part of the whole pipeline. So we're going to be deploying our own image that we're going to build during the pipeline from our Java Maven app project and then deploy that image into Kubernetes cluster. And we're going to see how that works in the next session.